Hello and welcome to JLM University. My name's Paul and today I'm going to show you how to change out a motor shaft cradle assembly. Please check the description below for a list of recommended tools. Before doing any work on your Power Pole Move PV, be sure to turn off the power and beware of pinch points. Now we're going to use our Phillips screwdriver to remove the two Phillips pan head screws on either side of the upper shroud assembly along with lock washers. Now that the screws have been removed, we're going to simply raise the upper shroud assembly. Now that the upper shroud assembly has been raised, we're going to take a Phillips screwdriver and we're going to remove the two screws along with lock washers from the cover of the steering circuit board. Now to remove the cover, just take your two fingers and simply just pull out and straight up on it. Okay, now we're going to use a flat-headed screwdriver to place in the slot on the upper shroud pin, and while holding that in position, we're going to use our ratchet with our 3/16 attachment to break it free. Once loose, you want to simply remove the screw along with the washer. Okay, now we want to repeat the same process on the opposite side. Once the last screw is removed, you can remove the upper shroud assembly. Now we're going to stow the Power Pole Move PV to remove the nav head. Now we're going to use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the 7 brass screws underneath the navigation head. Now that the brass screws have been removed, we're going to remove the navigation head by simply pulling straight out on it and disconnecting the white power lead connector. Now we're going to remove the last 4 brass screws that hold the coil mold over retainer on. Okay, now that the 4 brass screws have been removed, we're going to remove the coil cable mold over retainer. Now we're going to remove the coil cable from the base of the nav head by simply pulling straight out on it. Now use a 9/64" Allen key with a ratchet to remove the cap screws underneath the bottom of the navigation head. Now we're going to use our flat-headed screwdriver to pry the clamp from the shaft. Now remove the navigation head base. Now it's time to remove the shaft from the unit, and we're going to do this by slightly deploying it and then disengaging the shaft clamp. Now we're going to slide the clamp a few inches up the shaft. At this time, we're going to deploy the unit by pushing on the foot pedal and also supporting the motor until it disengages from the propulsion motor cradle. Now it's time to remove the shaft from the unit. You'll do this by disengaging the shaft clamp and pulling the shaft out of the steering motor. While supporting the propulsion motor and pulling the shaft out, make sure you have clearance. Now for the next step of the process, we are going to need to redeploy the unit. Now we're going to be removing the pivot arm brackets, port and starboard, along with the crossbar assembly, along with compliance rings with a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips screwdriver. Let's start by removing the 2 screws from the crossbar. Now let's remove the crossbar assembly. Now we're going to remove the springs from the pivot arms by pulling up and over the pins. Now we're going to be removing our 3/8 E-clip with a flat-headed screwdriver. Now that we've taken the E-clips off, we're going to remove the pins. Now that the pins have been removed, we're going to rotate the bracket forward. Now that the foot pedal bracket has been removed, the pivot arm can come off very easily. Be sure to remove your white nylon bushings. Now it's time to remove the propulsion motor cradle. We'll do this by removing the trim plate on the cover on one side. Now we're going to use our plastic pry bar to pry the trim plate out. Now that the covers have been removed from the propulsion motor cradle, we're going to use a 7/16 socket and ratchet to remove the 2 screws. Now that the cam arm is loose, we can easily remove it. Now it's time to remove the other cam arm along with the lower assembly. Now we're going to disassemble the cradle by removing the trim tab on the other cam arm. Now that the cover has been removed, we're going to use a 7/16 socket and ratchet to remove the screws to detach the cradle. Now it's time to install your new propulsion cradle. To start this process, we need to make sure the cam arm is oriented properly. Be sure that the rubber seat is facing away from the steering motor. Now we're going to connect our propulsion motor cradle to our left cam arm. Ensure that the spring mechanism is facing out and the L is on the left. Before attaching the cradle to the cam arm, you'll need to put 1 drop of blue Loctite to each of the holes. Be sure to use your torque wrench and tighten to the specific torque specifications found in your instructions provided. Now it's time to install our cam arms with our cradle assembly. First, we're going to install our white nylon bushing on the upper pin of our steering motor housing. Next, we're going to install our cam arm with our cradle assembly. Now add your second cam arm and align the screws. Add 1 drop of blue Loctite to the threads. Now that the cam arm is installed, we're going to install our cam arm covers. Add your trim piece. Now it's time to install our pivot bracket arms, but first you want to install your white nylon bushings to each side of the upper pin. Before installing the pivot bracket arm, be sure that the pin for the spring is facing in. Before you secure your pivot arms, you want to install your crossbar assembly in between the 2 arms. Make sure your compliance rings are on the bar. Next, secure your crossbar with the 2 screws and be sure to use Loctite. Next, we need to attach our spring to the upper pivot arm and to the lower pivot bracket plate. Now we will flip the foot release arms back to align. While holding the arm in position, insert your pin. Next, we want to install our E-clips onto the pin with our E-clip tool. Now we are ready to install our shaft, but first we need to put the unit in the stowed position. Push down on the foot release pedal and then pull up on the cradle until it locks into position. Align the shaft and run it through the bottom of the steering housing. And now that the shaft has been installed about halfway, you want to install your shaft clamp. Be sure that the P is facing up. Now we will secure the propulsion motor into the cradle. Next, we need to slide on the navigation head base onto the shaft and install our clamp. And now align this tab on the clamp up with a keyhole in the shaft. Now we're going to replace our nylon lock nuts into the holes with a nylon of the nut facing outward on both sides. And now we're going to install our cap screws onto each side. Now that the navigation head base is torqued into position, we're going to install our coil cable. Before inserting the coil cable, be sure that the vent tube aligns the groove in the coil cable. Now we want to feed the white connector through the mold-over retainer. Now that the mold-over retainer is into position, we want to install our 4 brass screws. It's now time to install your navigation head. Be sure you plug your white connector in and you should hear a click. Now place the white connector into its holder. Now it's time to finish installing the navigation head. We'll do this by tucking the wires into the groove of the connector holder. It's important that these wires are routed correctly so they do not get pinched. Now insert your 7 brass screws. Now it's time to deploy the PowerPole Move PV. It's now time to install the rear cover. Be sure to torque the screws. Now it is time to install the upper shroud. First, we're going to install our washers on the very inside of the upper shroud. Now that the washers are in position, we're going to place it in line with the upper pin. Next, we're going to place the sides of the upper shrouds in position. Now we need to place our washer onto the screw and install it into the upper pin of the upper shroud. And add 1 drop of blue Loctite to the ends of threads. And the last thing we need to do is to install the 2 screws on either side of the upper shroud. And that is how you change out a motor shaft cradle assembly on a PowerPole Move PV. Thank you for watching.